Wyoming Territory, summer of 1879. The sun was barely up and the wind already carried heat when Odessa Blake swung the axe down hard, splitting the last log before wiping her brow with the back of a dirt-streaked hand. Her dress was soaked through with sweat at the collar, and her arms ached from 3 hours of chopping. But the woodpile was done. One more thing she could cross off before the sun climbed too high. Her cabin sat alone in a wide stretch of grassland, backed by a thin line of pines and a ridge rising behind. The roof needed patching. The garden was half dead, and the chickens had taken to laying eggs wherever they pleased. But it was hers. After 8 years married to a man who died owing more than he left, Odessa had no interest in depending on a soul ever again. She heard hooves before she saw him. A single rider came around the bend, his dappled horse kicking dust with each slow step. Odessa stiffened, her grip tightening on the axe handle. She did not care who he was. She did not want him here. The cowboy dismounted, tall and lean, with a rifle slung across his back and a battered hat shading his face. His boots were worn, spurs dusty, and his shirt was rolled to the elbows. He looked like a man who had ridden a long way without complaint. He tipped his hat when he reached the fence. "Morning, ma'am." Odessa did not move. "Whatever you're selling, I do not want it." "I am not selling anything," he said, voice low and easy. "Just passing through. Name's Thayer Tripp. You look like you could use a hand." "I do not want help," she said quickly, sharp. He nodded once, then leaned his arms on the top rail of the fence. "Then think of me as company you need." Odessa blinked. She had heard all kinds of talk from men over the years, some slick, some cruel, some plain false. But this man's voice had no edge to it, just calm, like river water. "You can keep riding," she said, turning her back on him. "I have no use for company either." She carried the axe to the shed, refusing to glance over her shoulder. But she could feel him still standing there, watching, not moving, like he was carved into the day. By noon he had not left. She found him sitting on an overturned crate near the barn, peeling an apple with the blade of a pocketknife. He had not touched her things, had not gone near the house. Just sat, letting the sun climb overhead as if he had all the time in the world. "You are not very good at taking a hint," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I am not here to fix your life," Thayer said, slicing a thin curl of apple and holding it in his palm. "Just figured maybe you would not mind someone quiet to eat with." She hesitated. Her stomach reminded her she had not eaten since dawn. "Fine," she said, sitting on the step with a sigh. "But you are not staying." He passed her half the apple. "That is up to you." They ate in silence, the only sound the wind stirring the grass and the occasional cluck from the barn. Odessa stole a glance at him. His face was sun-browned, jaw marked by a few days' worth of stubble. He looked young, maybe 30, but there was something steady in his eyes, something worn in and sure. "You said you were passing through," she said after a while. "Where from?" "Texas Panhandle," he said. "Left a month ago. Had no real plan. Just kept riding." "Why?" Thayer looked out toward the ridge. Was not much left to stay for. Her breath caught. She knew that feeling far too well. She stood before she could let the quiet settle too much. "I have things to do." He nodded. "You want me to go?" She hesitated. "I do not want help." "I know," he said, standing slowly. "But even company can carry a bucket." Thayer stayed. He did not ask questions. He just worked. He cleared the garden rows without being told, hauled water without being asked. He never stepped inside the house, not once, and always slept near the barn under a wool blanket. Odessa told herself it was temporary, that she was only letting him stay because the fence needed mending and her shoulder still ached from when she fell last week. But then came the storm. It rolled in just before sunset, sudden and hard, sending wind tearing across the land. Odessa had barely secured the shutters when she heard the panicked cries the chickens had broken loose, scattered into the wild dark. She grabbed her lantern, heart pounding, and ran. She did not get far. Her boots slipped in the mud, and she went down hard on her side, breath knocked clean out of her chest. She could not move. Pain sliced up her ribs. "Odessa!" Thayer's voice. Then the thud of boots, the light swinging wildly as he found her. "You are hurt." "I am fine," she gasped, trying to sit up. He crouched beside her, his hands careful. "You are not. Do not move. I said I do not want help." He met her eyes, his voice steady. "Then think of me as company you need." Something cracked in her chest then. Not ribs. Something older. Something deeper. He lifted her like she weighed nothing and carried her inside. Laid her on the bed without a word, his hands gentle. He lit the stove, warmed broth, checked her side. There was no break, but deep bruising. She would not be walking for days. Thayer stayed. Through the rain and wind, he kept the fire going. Cooked, fed the animals, made sure she had everything she needed without fuss or comment. And when she could not sleep from the pain, he sat beside the bed and told her stories about his childhood, how he once got bucked off a mule into a river, how he used to race his brother across the plains until their lungs burned. Odessa found herself smiling, laughing even, something she had not done in a long, long time. One night, she woke from a nightmare, breath caught in her throat. She had not cried in years, but something in the dark cracked her wide open. Thayer sat up from his spot near the hearth. "You all right?" She shook her head, tears running hot down her cheeks. "I do not know how to do this anymore." He crossed the room, kneeling beside her. "You do not have to do it alone." Her hand reached for his without thinking. He held it gently, like he had all the time in the world. She looked at him, really looked. "Why are you still here?" "Because," he said softly, "I want to be." And for the first time in years, she let herself believe it might be true. By the time Odessa could walk again without leaning on the doorframe, the alfalfa in the lower field had gone from green to gold. She didn't remember the last time she'd seen a harvest come in without dread curling in her gut about how she'd manage it alone. She still woke early, still worked until dusk. But the silence didn't weigh the same as it used to. Not with Thayer nearby, quiet, constant, taking up space without taking it over. She found him one morning sitting by the corral, tracing something into the dirt with a stick. The horses were grazing lazy behind him, and the air still smelled of dew. "Is that supposed to be a map?" she asked, leaning on the fence post. He glanced up. "More like memory. Trying to draw the land I rode before I found your place. Thought it might help me figure where I'm going next." Odessa glanced at the lines. "You don't know?" He dusted his hands off on his trousers. "Didn't plan to stay this long." She nodded, not trusting her voice. She'd known he wouldn't stay forever. She just hadn't realized how much she didn't want him to leave. He stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "I could take the horses out today. Check the north fence. You mentioned it hadn't been ridden in a while." She didn't remember mentioning it, but she nodded. "You take the mare. She handles the slope better." He tipped his hat and walked toward the barn. Odessa turned back to the house, heart heavy in a way she wasn't ready to name. That afternoon, with the sun sinking low, she caught sight of him through the kitchen window. He was leading the mare back, his shirt clinging to his back, a fresh tear at the shoulder. When he reached the stoop, he held something out. "Found this near the west end of the ridge," he said. "Looks like it belonged to someone, maybe a child." It was a doll handmade, limp from rain and sun, its stitched mouth nearly worn through. Odessa took it gently. There used to be a family out that way, before the cattle drives started running through. They left one spring and didn't come back. Thayer studied her a moment. You knew them. I taught their little girl letters once a week, she said. She was quiet. Like you. He didn't answer. He just sat on the steps and pulled off his boots, one at a time. Later, after supper, he lingered by the window, arms folded over his chest. You ever think about leaving? He asked. She didn't answer right away. Every winter. Then spring comes, and I stay. He nodded slowly. I never stayed anywhere longer than a season. Not since my brother died. Odessa turned. You never said you had a brother. Didn't see the need. He was older. Always had the plans. I just followed. And when he died? Thayer's gaze drifted. I kept riding, like I was still following, even though there wasn't anything ahead of me anymore. Odessa walked over, slow. You've done more for me in a few weeks than anyone's done in 10 years. If you're trying to find meaning, you already have. He met her eyes, the last of the daylight catching in his lashes. You think that's enough? I think it's more than most people ever get. They stood there, the silence thick between them, not awkward, just full. Odessa felt something shift, like a door easing open by its own weight. That night, when the wind picked up and the shutters rattled, she stepped outside and found him sitting on the porch, legs stretched out, eyes on the stars. You always sit out here when the wind comes? She asked. He nodded. It sounds like the plains down south. Used to put me to sleep. She sat beside him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his arm. You're not sleeping tonight? Didn't want to miss anything. She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't have to. A long moment passed, and then she reached over and took his hand, calloused, warm, steady. He didn't flinch or shift. He just laced his fingers through hers like they'd always fit that way. Neither of them spoke again before sunrise. They didn't have to. By late August, the land had turned brittle beneath the sun, and Odessa found herself thinking more often about the scent of rain than the weight of heat. The fields were holding, but just barely. She moved slower in the afternoons, the days lengthening in ways that felt less urgent now. The edges of her solitude softened by the quiet things Thayer did without asking. One morning, as she pulled the last of the onions from the dirt, she noticed him near the shed, crouched over something she couldn't see. His hat was on the ground beside him, his shirt damp with sweat between his shoulders. She rose and dusted her hands on her skirt. You working on a mystery out there? She called. He didn't look up. Found a broken hinge on the wagon box. Thought I'd see if it could be fixed. I haven't used that wagon in 3 years. I can tell. He leaned back on his heels, brushing rust from his fingers. But if you ever needed to, it wouldn't take much to make it right. She crossed the yard, stopping a few feet from him. You think I'll just wake up one day needing to leave? I think it's better to have the means, even if you don't use them. Odessa watched him for a long moment. You fix things like you're afraid they'll be lost if you don't. Thayer wiped his hands on a rag. Maybe I am. She didn't press. The wind was picking up from the west, and the air had a dry sharpness to it. She tilted her face to the sky. Storm's coming. He stood, his palm shading his eyes. Likely by nightfall. You want me to bring in the harnesses? I already did, but the goat's still tied near the creek. I'll get her. As he walked off, she realized how natural it had become to divide the work between them. Not by talk or plan, just a rhythm they'd fallen into, unspoken but steady. She hadn't decided to trust him. It had happened like breath. That evening, when the wind hit hard and sudden, they moved without speaking, shutters fastened, tools gathered, animals secured. The first crack of thunder rolled low across the ridge when Odessa stepped back into the house and found Thayer standing by the hearth, holding a rough tin box she hadn't seen in years. I was looking for more lamp oil, he said, lifting the lid. And found this behind the shelf. She walked over, her chest tightening. Inside were old letters, tied in twine, and a worn ribbon she hadn't touched since the 3rd year of her marriage. She reached out, her hand hovering. I forgot it was still here. He didn't ask, just waited. She sat slowly at the table. I used to write letters to my sister in Missouri. She stopped writing back a long time ago. You kept hers. I was lonely, and I thought if I read them enough, maybe I'd feel like someone remembered me. The wind howled against the windows, and the lamp flickered. Thayer closed the box, slid it across the table to her. You don't have to be remembered to be seen. She looked at him, the words catching on something inside her. You ever think about staying? She asked, her voice quiet. He sat across from her, elbows resting on the wood. I do. Then why haven't you said so? Because I didn't want to say it before you could hear it. She reached across the table, her fingers grazing his. I hear it now. His hand turned beneath hers, fingers warm and certain. Outside, the storm broke, rain hitting the roof in hard, steady rhythm. Inside, the air held a stillness between them, not empty, but full of something new, something earned. You're not company anymore, she said. You're something else. He nodded once, eyes steady. Then let me be whatever you need. Odessa leaned forward, her forehead resting against his. Stay. He didn't answer with words. He just closed the space between them, quiet as breath, sure as rain over open land. The days after the storm settled into a rhythm unlike the ones before. The fields dried slower, the air cooler in the mornings, and Odessa found herself waiting for Thayer's footsteps on the porch each dawn, not because she needed them, but because they'd become part of the quiet she'd come to trust. She stood at the stove one morning, turning biscuits in the pan with a practiced hand, when he walked in without knocking. He carried an old saddlebag, the leather cracked and weathered, something she hadn't seen before. You're going somewhere, she said, not turning from the stove. No, he said, setting the bag on the table. I'm finishing something. He pulled out a folded piece of canvas and unrolled it carefully. Inside lay a pair of boots, stiff with age, soles worn thin. Odessa wiped her hands and crossed to him, eyes narrowing. They're yours? She asked. They were my brother's, he said. Been carrying them since the day I buried him in the Llano Estacado. I think it's time they stop riding with me. She ran her fingers along the cracked leather. You kept them all this time? He nodded. I thought if I let them go, I'd lose the last piece of him. She lifted her gaze. And now, I think maybe holding on's what kept me from ever stopping anywhere. Odessa folded the canvas back over the boots and tied the strap. You want to bury them here? Only if you think there's room for more ghosts. She reached for the bag. I do. They walked to the north field together, past the line of cottonwoods that marked the edge of her land. Odessa hadn't set foot beyond them since the winter her husband died. Now, with Thayer beside her, the distance didn't feel so wide. He dug the hole himself, steady and quiet, the sun climbing behind his shoulder. When he was done, he laid the boots inside without ceremony, as if he were placing them beneath a blanket. He'd have liked this place, he said, brushing dirt from his hands. What was he like? She asked. Mean as a cornered badger, he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. But he had a way of making you believe the world might still be worth something. Odessa crouched, settling her palm against the earth. You carry that same thing, just quieter. They walked back without speaking. The wind had picked up by the time they reached the house, lifting dust in soft curls. Odessa paused at the door. I've been thinking, she said, about the back room. Thayer leaned against the doorframe. What about it? It's got good light in the morning. Would make a fine place for someone to keep a saddlebag, if they wanted to stay. He didn't answer right away. Just looked at her with that steady, unreadable gaze she'd come to know. You sure? I wouldn't bring it up if I wasn't. He stepped inside, setting his hat on the peg by the door. Then I guess I'll start by fixing the latch on that window. Been rattling since the storm. That afternoon, they worked side by side in the room, him with a hammer and her with a brush, sweeping dust from the floorboards. Odessa didn't speak of what it meant, didn't ask what might come next. But when the light shifted through the window and caught his face just so, she felt something inside her settle. Not the absence of loneliness, but the presence of something better. That evening, she made a stew thick with barley and sage, and they ate with the windows open, the smell of drying earth drifting in. After the plates were cleared, Thayer stood and pulled something from his pocket, a thin strip of red cloth, frayed at the edge. I found this down by the creek, caught on a branch, he said, offering it. Might have been yours once. Odessa took it, turning the fabric over in her fingers. It was hers, a scrap from a dress she hadn't worn in years, lost during a wash when the river ran high. I used to wear that dress when I first came here, she said. Felt like it made me look less alone. You don't need it for that anymore. She looked up at him, her fingers curling around the cloth. No, I don't. He leaned in, slow and certain, and brushed his lips against her forehead. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of it sink deep. Sleep well, he said. Stay, she whispered. Not as a question but a truth she was finally ready to speak aloud. And he did. The first frost came early that year, brushing the tops of the grass with silver and turning the breath in Odessa's lungs to mist. She stood at the root cellar door, a basket of apples at her hip, and watched as Thayer drove the last of the fence posts into the far edge of the pasture. The hammer rose and fell with the same quiet rhythm he'd carried since the day he arrived. No rush, no waste, just the kind of steadiness that made her chest ache if she looked too long. He glanced up, catching her eye. She didn't look away. Inside, the house had begun to shift. The back room bore his mark now. A few books stacked by the cot, a carved pipe on the windowsill. His coat hung neatly beside hers. His presence didn't overtake the space, it settled into it, like water into dry earth, filling what had long gone unused. Later, with dinner cleared and the lamps turned low, Odessa sat on the floor by the hearth, mending the hem of her shawl. Thayer sat near her, oiling the handle of a drawknife, his hands careful. You ever think about building something more permanent here? He asked without lifting his gaze. She tied off her thread. You mean more than a patched roof and a stubborn garden? I mean a future that doesn't feel borrowed. She set the shawl aside. I used to tell myself this land was all I'd ever need, that if I kept it going, I'd outrun the rest. You're not outrunning anything now. No, she said softly. Not anymore. He turned to face her, arms resting on his knees. I've been thinking about adding on to the barn. If I'm going to keep my saddle here, I may as well keep a second horse. She raised an eyebrow. You planning on staying long enough to need another? I'm planning on staying long enough to build a life worth the keeping. The firelight caught his face, casting warmth across the scar near his temple, the one he hadn't spoken of and she hadn't asked about. She'd learned not to chase what others weren't ready to give, only to leave space for it when they were. She rose and crossed to him, kneeling beside the chair. I don't know what comes next, but I know I want to face it with someone who doesn't flinch when the wind rises. He reached up, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. We could start with winter. See how we manage that. Odessa smiled, not from habit but from the deep, quiet place that had begun to thaw in her. I've got extra quilts, she said. And I've got good boots, he replied. thumb tracing the edge of her jaw. She leaned forward, forehead resting against his. "Then we'll be all right." The weeks that followed were filled with preparation. They split firewood and cured meat, stacked dried beans in jars along the shelves. Thayer built a smokehouse from scrap lumber and lined it with pine. Odessa taught him how to make soap from ash and fat, laughing as he scowled at the smell. They didn't speak of what they were, or what name to put on what had grown between them. They didn't need to. It was there in the way he reached for her calloused hand without thinking, in the way she poured his coffee before he asked, in the silence that never felt empty. As the snow came, steady and soft, Thayer crafted a rocking chair for the front porch from cedar limbs left behind in the woodshed. He carved her initials into the arm and gave it to her without preamble. "That's a fine thing," she said, tracing the letters. "You do this for every woman who lets you mend her fences?" "No," he said, slipping his arms around her from behind. "Only the one who builds something back in me." That night, lying beside one another for the first time in her narrow bed, they didn't speak. Odessa curled into the warmth of his chest, the beat of his heart sure beneath her ear, his hand in her hair, steady and slow. And in the hush between breaths, she felt something settle inside her, a peace she'd never thought to know. By spring, the barn walls were higher, the garden rose neater, and a new foal blinked at the morning light from the straw near the stall. Thayer named her Mercy, said it was fitting. On the first warm day, Odessa walked the ridge where she'd once stood alone. This time, Thayer walked beside her, palm brushing hers, fingers interlaced. "Do you miss the road?" she asked, eyes on the far horizon. "Only when I dream," he said. "But I wake up here." She nodded, the wind tugging her braid loose. They made a life not quick or loud, but with care. He built her a writing desk from oak, and she wrote letters again, not to the past, but to the future. She taught reading to a neighbor's boy each Sunday on the porch, and Thayer helped fell a line of dead cottonwoods for a man whose hand had gone stiff from age. They shared stew with travelers when the roads thawed, and when the town preacher came by to ask if they'd like to make things official, they looked at each other and said yes at the same time. They married in the grove behind the house, Thayer in a clean shirt, Odessa in her mother's brooch pinned at the collar. No music, no crowd, just the wind in the grass, the rustle of branches, and the vow that came without hesitation. "I will stand with you," she said. "I will carry this with you," he answered. Years passed, the porch filled with rockers. A second barn rose beyond the first. They never left the land, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't need to. What they'd built was not a shelter from the world, but a place where it could finally reach them and find them ready. And in the evenings, when the light turned gold, Odessa sat in the chair he made, her knitting in her lap, while Thayer whittled beside her. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't, but always they were together, and that, at last, was enough.